What would you do if a wooden crate came rolling into your town on a freight wagon, addressed in faded ink to a man who had been dead for 40 years, and the clerk handed you the pen and asked you to sign for it? What would you do if the name on that crate was the name every old-timer in the valley still whispered after dark, and the weight of it settled onto your porch like a stone dropped into still water? In Dry Creek, a 19-year-old girl named Grace Cooper signed her name below an Outlaw's and hauled the crate home by lantern light for the price of 6 bits and a promise. But what waited inside would rewrite the memory of every family along the valley. Stay close. Settle in. This one is worth the walking. Grace Cooper came back to Dry Creek on a Tuesday, in the last blue hour before evening, with her father 3 weeks in the ground and her mother's cough still ringing in her ears from the long ride south. She rode in the back of a freighter's wagon because she could not afford the stage, her carpet bag between her knees, her boots dusted pale, her braid coming loose beneath a headscarf the color of dry grass. The road bent past the churchyard where her grandmother lay, past the sagging fence her father had meant to mend, past the livery where a boy she once knew now shoed horses for a wage that was not quite a living. Nobody waved. Word had gone ahead of her, the way word always did in a town where news traveled faster than weather. The Cooper girl was back. The Cooper girl had nothing. She climbed down at the depot and paid the freighter in coin she could not spare. The plank walk creaked beneath her. The wind smelled of wood smoke and horses and the faint copper tang that came off the creek when the water ran low. Above the mercantile, a lantern was already lit. Though the sun still bled orange along the ridge, Grace stood for a moment with her bag at her feet and looked at the town she had left at 15 and had sworn she would return to only when she had something to show for herself. She had come back with less than she left with. She had come back because there was nowhere else. The house at the end of Bell Lane was hers now, and the debts on it were hers too, and the small, stubborn hope she carried inside her chest was hers, and she meant to keep it. That night she slept in her father's chair by a cold stove, and dreamed of nothing, and woke to the sound of a wagon axle groaning down the frozen road. The freight came in on a Wednesday, hauled by 2 mules and driven by a man Grace did not know, a stranger with a beard the color of iron filings and a hat pulled low against the light. He drew up outside the depot and shouted for the clerk, and the clerk came out wiping his hands on his apron and squinted at the manifest, and then squinted harder. Grace was crossing the street with a sack of cornmeal balanced on her hip when she heard her family name called, and she stopped because it had been her father's name too, and she was not yet used to hearing it without him. The clerk waved her over. He tapped the paper with a knuckle. "Cooper property," he said. "You are the next of kin." Grace set the cornmeal down on the plank. She looked at the crate on the wagon bed. It was a pine box the size of a small trunk, banded with iron, its corners dark with the grease of long travel, and across the top, in a hand that had faded to the color of weak tea, was a name she had heard only in stories told after the lamps were low. Jubal Renner, the outlaw, the man who had ridden out of Dry Creek in 1848 with a posse behind him and had never come back, whose grave, if he had one, was somewhere in the Badlands, whose name the old men spoke the way children speak of wolves. 40 years dead, if he was dead at all, and the crate was addressed to him, and her name, Cooper, was written beneath his in a different ink, in a hand she almost knew. "He's been gone 40 years, Grace said. The clerk shrugged. "Paper says deliver. Paper says next of kin." "I am not his kin." "Paper says Cooper. You are the Cooper left." Behind her a small crowd had begun to gather, the way crowds gather in a town where nothing much happens and everything is remembered. She felt their eyes on the back of her neck. She heard someone laugh, short and mean. She heard someone else murmur a prayer. A boy pointed. A woman crossed herself. The freighter waited with his reins slack in his hands and his face like weathered leather, and he said nothing at all, because it was not his to say. Grace looked at the crate, and the crate looked back at her, iron-banded and silent and impossibly addressed, and she thought of her father in the ground, and of the mortgage note nailed to the door of the house on Bell Lane, and of the 6 bits in her apron pocket that was the last coin she had in the world. She signed. She paid the freight. She borrowed a handcart from the depot boy for the promise of a mended shirt, and she loaded the crate on it, and she pushed it home herself down the frozen ruts of Bell Lane by the light of a single kerosene lantern hung from the handle. The town watched her go. Somebody laughed again, louder this time. Somebody said, loud enough to carry, that the Cooper girl had come back to inherit a dead man's trouble, and that was about all a Cooper could expect. Grace did not turn her head. Her breath made small ghosts in the lantern light. The crate rattled. The wheels groaned. The night pressed in. What would drive a girl with nothing to sign her name below an outlaw's? What could possibly wait inside a crate addressed to a man 40 years in the grave? And why, of all the Coopers who had ever lived and died in Dry Creek, was hers the name written in fresh ink beneath his? If a story like this pulls you in, leave a word below and tell where you are listening from tonight, and follow along so the next chapter finds you. Because when Grace Cooper pried open that pine lid by lantern light, what she saw inside was only the beginning. By morning, the story had traveled the length of Dry Creek twice and come back changed. That was the way of the town. A thing said at the depot at dusk was a thing said in the mercantile by breakfast, and a thing said in the mercantile by breakfast was a thing muttered over the pews by Sunday. Whether Sunday had come yet or not, Grace woke in her father's chair with the lantern guttered out and the crate squatting in the middle of the front room like a stone dropped through the roof. She had not opened it. She had meant to, and she had not. She had sat before it with the pry bar in her lap and the iron bands catching the last of the lantern light, and somewhere between one breath and the next, the weight of the day had folded her down into sleep. Now the stove was cold, and the window was gray, and the crate was still there, still real, still marked with an outlaw's name in faded ink and hers below it in a hand she almost knew. She went out for water because the bucket was dry, and because she could not yet bear to be alone in a room with the thing. The pump at the corner of Bell Lane creaked under her hand. A woman across the way twitched her curtain and let it fall. Down the street, 2 men stopped talking when Grace passed, and started again behind her in a lower register. The word Renner traveled on the cold air like smoke. Grace kept her eyes on the tin bucket, and her braid tucked back beneath the dry grass scarf, and did not slow her step. At the mercantile, she traded a mended button for a twist of salt, and the woman behind the counter, whose name Grace had known since she was small enough to sit on the flour barrels, would not quite meet her eye. "You be careful, girl," the woman murmured, and did not say of what. Outside, a knot of boys hooted from the far side of the water trough. One of them, no more than 10, called across the road that the Cooper girl had a dead man in her parlor. Another laughed. A third crossed himself the way his mother had taught him and did not laugh at all. Grace was halfway back down Bell Lane with the bucket heavy on her hip when the shadow of a horse fell across the ruts in front of her, and she looked up into the face of a man she had hoped not to see. He sat the saddle easy. He wore a good coat and a hat that had never been rained on hard. His name was Rusk Mallon, and he held the paper on the house at the end of Bell Lane, and he had held it since before her father took ill. "Miss Cooper," he said. "Mr. Mallon." He smiled the way a man smiles at a child who has picked up something too heavy. "I hear you've come into an inheritance." Grace said nothing. "A whole crate of it," Mallon said. "Addressed to a bandit 40 years cold." "Well, that's the Cooper luck, isn't it? Your daddy chased a dry claim 10 years running. Now his girl signs her name under a thief's." He leaned down over the pommel. His voice softened, which was worse. "The note's due in 30 days, Miss Cooper. I don't imagine an outlaw left you coin. When the time comes, you come see me, and we'll talk about what a girl alone can afford." He tipped his hat. He rode on. Grace stood in the ruts with the bucket cutting into her hip, and did not move until the sound of his horse was gone. She was almost to her own door when the last voice of the morning found her. An old man sat on the bench outside the smithy with his hands folded on the head of a hickory cane, his eyes the pale blue of a sky washed thin. She had known him all her life without ever having spoken to him. He was called Old Hollis, and he had been old when her father was a boy. He watched her come, and he watched her pass, and when she was almost by him, he spoke once without turning his head. "Girl," he said. "What was buried was not what was lost." Grace stopped. She looked at him. His mouth had already closed. His eyes were on the road, or on something past the road, in a country she could not see. She waited, and he did not speak again, and after a long moment she went on down Bell Lane with the words settling into her like cold water into a well. She carried them into the house. She set the bucket by the stove. She looked at the crate in the middle of the room, iron-banded and silent, and the words sat behind her eyes and would not move. She did not open it that day either. That was the strange thing, and she could not have said why, except that old Hollis's line had put a hand on her chest and asked her to wait. And she had learned young to trust an old man's hand more than a young man's smile. She built the fire back up with the last of the split pine. She boiled water. She ate a heel of cornbread standing at the window because the chair felt too much like her father's shape. She watched the light go blue over the ridge and then go out. The house was cold in a way she had forgotten houses could be cold. The wind came in under the door in a thin, steady thread and moved the hem of her skirt. Somewhere a shutter knocked once and stopped. The crate sat where she had left it, and she found that she had pulled her father's chair around to face it, the way one faces a stranger at a table waiting to see who will speak first. She lit the lantern. She set it on the crate. The light pooled on the pine lid and picked out the two names, one above the other. Jubal Renner in faded tea-colored ink, and Cooper in a hand that she had begun, in the long, slow hours since Wednesday, to believe she recognized. It was not her father's hand. It was older than her father's hand. It had the same lean in the C, the same short cross on the R, but it belonged to someone who had learned to write in a schoolroom before her father was born. She slept in the chair again that night. She did not mean to. She meant to keep watch, though she could not have said over what. Twice she woke, and each time the crate was where it had been, and the lantern was burning low, and the wind was moving in the eaves like a slow animal turning over in its sleep. Once, near the deepest part of the dark, she thought she heard something inside the crate settle. The small shift of weight against wood, the way an old dog will resettle its bones by a fire. She held her breath until her chest ached. The sound did not come again. She told herself it was the cold working the boards. She told herself it was the house. By dawn, she had made a decision without quite making it. She would live with the thing a day longer. She would boil coffee on the stove, where her mother had boiled coffee. She would set her hand flat on the pine lid, the way one sets a hand on a horse's flank before mounting, to let the animal know a rider is coming. And then, when the light was right, she would open it. The light, she thought, would tell her when. Morning came slow into the front room on Bell Lane, the color of skimmed milk against the east window, and Grace stood at the stove with her palms held over the first heat and watched the crate the way a person watches a stranger sleeping in a chair across the room. She had boiled the coffee thin. There was not much left in the tin. She poured a cup and carried it to her father's chair and sat with the cup on her knee and looked at the pine lid and at the two names written there. In the daylight, the ink of Jubal Renner had gone almost the color of the wood itself, as though the name were trying to sink back into the grain and be forgotten. The name Cooper stood clearer. Grace leaned closer. She had spent the night believing she recognized the hand. Now, in the plain gray light, she was sure of it in a way that made her set the coffee down on the floor. The C had the same forward lean as the C in the family Bible on the shelf above the stove, the Bible her grandmother had kept, the Bible in which her grandmother had written every birth and every death in a hand that had learned itself in a schoolroom back east before the war. Grace stood up. She crossed the room. She took the Bible down and opened it on the table and turned it toward the window and looked at the writing on the first blank page, where her grandmother had set down the Cooper names in careful ink. And then she looked at the crate. The Cooper on the crate and the Cooper in the Bible had been written by the same hand. Her grandmother had been in the churchyard 11 years. Grace stood at the table a long time. She did not cry. She only set the flat of her hand on the open Bible, and then walked back to the crate, and set the flat of her hand on the pine lid, and felt the cold of it come up into her palm. Something under the lid, or something in her, shifted. She did not open the crate. She had told herself she would wait for the light, and the light was still gray, and the decision she had made without making it the night before now felt like a rope she had to hold. She went out instead. She went to fetch wood. The pile behind the house was low, no more than 2 armloads of split pine and a handful of kindling, and Grace carried what there was in against her apron and stacked it by the stove, and then went back out to the woodshed to see what her father had left. In the shed, she found a splitting maul with a loose head, a stack of unsplit rounds gone gray on the outside, and, at the back wall behind an old canvas, a length of iron banding she did not at first understand. She lifted it into the light from the shed door. It was the same width as the banding on the crate. It was the same iron. It had been cut clean at one end and rough at the other, as though someone had once used a piece of the same batch for another purpose here in this shed, in her father's shed, in her grandmother's shed before that. Grace laid the banding down on the workbench and stood with her hand on it. Outside, a jay called once from the ridge and then was quiet. She did not know what to do with what she was learning. She only knew she had learned it. She went back inside and set the maul against the wall, and stood at the stove and warmed her hands. The crate was where it had been. She would not open it yet. She had decided, without deciding, that she would first put her hands on the house. If the house had been keeping a thing from her, the house would tell her. The way a horse tells a rider through the reins if the rider is quiet enough to feel it. She began with the stove. She scraped the ash out into a tin pail. She wiped the flat top with a damp rag and watched the water hiss and lift. She swept the front room with a broom whose straw was worn on one side. She swept around the crate without touching it. She washed the 2 front windows with vinegar water and a strip of muslin, and the light coming in afterward was cleaner and colder, and showed her the room the way she had not seen it since she was 15. It showed her the smoke stain above the stove. It showed her the place on the doorframe where her father had marked her height with a nail scratch when she was 6, and again when she was 10, and again when she was 12, and then not again. It showed her the loose board by the window. She knelt to that board. She had known that board her whole life. It had always given a little under the foot. She had never once thought about it. Now, with her fingers on the crack, she thought about it. She fetched the pry bar she had slept with in her lap 2 nights running, and worked the flat end into the crack and lifted, gentle, the way one lifts a scab from a healing place, and the board came up. Under it was a shallow space between the joists, and in the shallow space was a small tin box, the kind that had once held tea, its lid rusted to the body. Grace lifted the tin out and set it on the floor. She did not open it. Her hands were shaking, and she did not want to open a second thing with shaking hands. She put the board back. She stood up. She carried the tin to the table and set it beside the Bible and looked at them both and then at the crate, which was 3 things now waiting for her instead of 1. Outside, a wagon went by on Bell Lane, and she heard the driver cluck to his horses, and the sound was ordinary, and the ordinary sound steadied her. She went out to the pump for more water. The bucket knocked her knee as she walked, a small dumb comfort, a companion of tin and rope, and she found she was talking to it under her breath, telling it what she had found and what she would do next, the way her father had used to talk to his old bay gelding when he was working out a hard piece of thinking. She fed the stove another split. She set water to boil. She sat in her father's chair and looked across at the crate and across at the tin box and across at the open Bible, and she waited for her hands to stop shaking. When they had stopped, she stood up and went to the shed and brought in the loose maul and set to fixing its head, because her hands needed a thing to do that was not opening what she was not yet ready to open, and because her grandmother, who had written the name on the crate, had raised a daughter who had raised her, and none of them had ever left a tool broken when they could mend it. The wedge went in true. The head sat. She hung the maul on its peg. The light in the window had turned by then, the color of pale honey, and she thought, not yet, but soon. Grace waited until the light in the front window was the color of a hen's egg held to the sun, thin gold with a warmth behind it, and then she knelt by the crate. She set the lantern on the floor beside her, though the room did not need it. She wanted the small, steady flame near her hand. She fitted the pry bar under the pine lid, where the nails had already loosened from the long freight roads, and she worked the iron slowly, hearing each nail give the way an old man gives up a grudge, 1 grain of wood at a time. She did not hurry. She thought of her grandmother's hand shaping the name Cooper on the lid, and of that same hand pressing ink into the Bible. And she thought that whatever had been packed inside had been packed by a woman who had not hurried either. The lid came free. Grace lifted it and set it against the wall. She did not look yet. She kept her eyes on the floorboards a moment, breathing, and then she raised them. Straw. That was the first thing. Loose winter straw, packed close, the color of old brass. She lifted a handful and set it aside. Beneath the straw was a folded square of oilskin, waxed dark. Beneath the oilskin was a leather satchel worn white at the seams. Beneath the satchel, at the corners, were smaller bundles wrapped in muslin and tied with string. Grace lifted them out one by one and laid them on the floor around her, as though she were setting a table for someone who had been long expected. She opened the satchel first. Inside were papers, a deed on heavy stock, folded 3 times, the ink still black. A brand registration for a mark she did not know, a running C over a bar. A bill of sale for 40 head of cattle sold in a town she had never heard of. And beneath those, tied with a green ribbon gone gray, a bundle of letters. The top letter was addressed in her grandmother's hand to J. Renner, in care of the mission at San Pedro, to be held. The next was the same, and the next. Grace counted 11 letters. She untied the ribbon and opened the first one, and read by the honey light at the window. The letter began, "Brother." Grace read the word twice before it fit. Her grandmother had written to Jubal Renner as brother. She read on. Her grandmother wrote of a child born safe, of a fence mended, of the price of flour, of a posse that had come through in October and asked after him and been sent on empty. She wrote that the land at the head of the valley was held in her name now, held for him, held until such a day as the trouble was done. She signed it with a single letter, the letter M, which was the initial Grace had seen 100 times inside the cover of the Bible without ever asking whose it was. Grace set the letter down. She put her palm flat on the floorboards to feel something solid. Jubal Renner, the outlaw dead 40 years, whose name had been spoken in Dry Creek only as a warning or a joke, had been her grandmother's brother. Her own great-uncle. The land at the head of the valley, the dry claim her father had chased for 10 years running, the claim Rusk Mallon had spoken of in that voice, was not a dry claim at all. It was held land, held for a man who had never come home to claim it, held now by the run of ink and blood, for her. She opened the muslin bundles next. In the first was a small revolver, oiled and wrapped, unloaded, with a note pinned to the cloth in her grandmother's hand that read only, "His, do not sell." In the second was a tintype of a young man in a dark coat, mustached, unsmiling, with eyes Grace recognized as her father's eyes and as her own. In the third was a lock of dark hair tied with the same green ribbon. In the fourth, heavier than the rest, was a canvas pouch. Grace loosened its throat. Inside were gold coins. Not many, not few. The honest weight of a life saved slowly by a person who could not spend openly. She counted them. There were 41. She thought at once, and without triumph, that the note on the house was $40 and could be paid, and 1 coin would be left, and that 1 coin she would not spend. She lifted the tin box from the table then and worked its rusted lid free with the pry bar. Inside, folded once, was a single sheet in her grandmother's hand, dated the year before the year she died. It read, "Grace, if it is you who finds this, then the others are gone and the ledger has come to you. Your great-uncle was not what they said. He was not all he should have been either. He was ours. The land is ours. Keep it. Do not sell. Do not explain. Live on it." That was all. Grace read it twice, then folded it, and set it on the Bible, and closed her eyes, and let the honey light lay itself across her face. The wind rose that afternoon and did not fall again. By the time Grace had put the crate's contents back in order and laid the letters flat inside the Bible and slid the pouch beneath the loose board where the tin had been, the sky over the ridge had gone the color of a bruise, and the wagon ruts on Bell Lane had begun to smoke with driven dust. She stood at the window and watched the light thin and thin and thin until it was gone entirely, and then the first hard grain of ice struck the glass, and the second, and the third, and she understood the weather had come. She banked the stove. She brought in what wood was left in the shed, 3 armloads carried against her chest with her chin holding the top piece. She filled the bucket at the pump, while the ice was still only ice and not yet the driven wall it would become, and she carried it inside and set it by the stove and shut the door and dropped the bar. The house creaked once, low, like a boat settling on a mooring. Grace sat down in her father's chair with the Bible open in her lap and the revolver on the table beside her, unloaded, and waited to see what the night meant to do. It meant to do a great deal. The wind came out of the north the way wind comes only 2 or 3 times in a winter, hard and steady and mean, and the ice turned to snow that blew sideways past the window and stacked against the door in a slow blue drift. The stove ate wood faster than Grace wanted to let it. She rationed. She sat close. She read the letters again by lantern light and learned her grandmother's brother the way a person learns a road at night, by touch and by trust. A little past what she thought must be midnight, over the roar of the wind, she heard a sound that was not the wind. A knock, then a second knock, then a voice, thinned by the storm, calling any name that might be inside. Grace stood. She crossed to the door. She lifted the bar. On the step were 2 people, snow-white and hunched. A woman with a shawl frozen stiff over her hair, and a child of perhaps 4 bundled inside the shawl against her chest. Behind them on the road, a horse stood with its head down and a wagon behind it, tipped hard onto one wheel where the drift had caught it. The woman's lips were the color of slate. She said, "Please." Grace took the child first because the child was closest, and then took the woman by the elbow and got them both inside, and shut the door against the wind with her shoulder and dropped the bar. She did not ask their names yet. She set the child on the rug by the stove and unwrapped the shawl and rubbed the small hands between her own. She took the woman's shawl off and hung it steaming from a chair back. She poured what was left of the thin coffee into a cup and put it in the woman's hands and closed the woman's fingers around it. The woman drank. The child began to cry, which Grace took as a good sign, because a child too cold to cry was a child in trouble past crying. "Your man," Grace said. "Gone ahead," the woman said. "For help. The wagon broke." "How long?" 2 hours, maybe more." Grace looked at the door. She looked at the stove. She looked at the child on the rug and at the woman in her father's chair with her hands around a cup she was not yet strong enough to lift to her mouth. She thought of the wood she had left, which was not enough for 3 through a night like this one, and of the pouch beneath the floorboards, which was not the kind of thing that kept a stove burning, and of the shed where the unsplit rounds still stood gray in the dark. She thought of her grandmother's letter. Live on it. Grace put on her father's coat. She wrapped the dry grass scarf twice around her face. She took the mended maul from its peg and the lantern from the crate lid and told the woman, "Feed the stove. Small pieces. Slow." The woman nodded. Grace went out into the storm. The shed was 15 paces from the back door, and the 15 paces took her a long time. She split rounds by lantern light with the wind pulling at her coat and the snow finding every seam. She split more than she needed. She carried the wood back in armloads, 4 trips, and each trip she thought once of turning her face from the door and lying down in the drift because it would be easier, and each time she did not. On the last trip she stopped at the wagon on the road and unhitched the horse and led it, stumbling, into the lean-to at the side of the house, and threw a blanket over its back, and left it there with its head against the boards, breathing hard and alive. When she came back inside the second time, the child was asleep on the rug, and the woman had built the fire up, small and steady, the way Grace had told her. Grace barred the door. She sat down on the floor by the stove because her legs had stopped holding her. She said, without meaning to say it aloud, We will make it to morning." The woman, watching her, said, "Yes," and they did. Morning came white and still. The storm had passed in the last dark hours and left Dry Creek buried to the fence tops, the ridge above town smoothed to a single pale line, and the sky the color of washed tin. Grace woke on the floor by the stove with her father's coat still on her shoulders. The child was awake and quiet on the rug, watching the fire. The woman was at the window. A man was coming down Bell Lane on foot, breaking trail with a shovel across his back, and the woman said his name once, low, and put her hand flat on the glass. Grace opened the door. The man came in stamping and did not speak for a long moment, only looked at his wife and his child and at Grace in her father's coat. And then he took Grace's hand in both of his and held it. He said, "Thank you." Grace said, "The horse is in the lean-to." He nodded and went out to see to it. By afternoon, the road was open enough that word had traveled. The woman's man had gone first to the mercantile, and then to the smithy, and then to the church, and he had told each place what a girl on Bell Lane had done in the night. The unnamed woman behind the mercantile counter closed her shop and came down the lane with a basket of eggs and a paper twist of coffee, and would not take anything for them. The depot boy came with an armload of split pine on a sled, and would not take anything either. He looked at the crate in the front room and did not ask. He looked at Grace and touched the brim of his cap and went back out. That evening, the kind professional came. He was a lawyer out of the county seat, an unnamed man in a black coat with snow melting off the shoulders, sent for by the man whose family Grace had sheltered, because the man had heard about the crate and had said a girl who did what she had done ought not to be alone with a stack of papers she could not read. The lawyer sat at Grace's table and opened the leather satchel with careful hands. He read the deed. He read the brand registration. He read the bill of sale. He read 3 of the letters. He set them down and folded his hands and said, "Miss Cooper, the land at the head of the valley is yours. It has been yours for 40 years. No one has known it but the woman who wrote these, and now you, and now me." Grace said, "Is it good land?" The lawyer said, "It is the best water in the valley." Grace said, "Can they take it?" The lawyer said, "No, not with these, not with the Bible, not with the coins to pay the back taxes twice over." He closed the satchel. He said, "Your grandmother was a careful woman." Grace said, "Yes." Rusk Mallon came the next morning. He rode down Bell Lane on the same horse in the same good coat and stopped at Grace's gate. Grace went out to meet him with her braid down her back and her father's coat on her shoulders. Rusk Mallon did not dismount. He looked at her a long time, and then he took off his hat, which Grace had never seen him do, and held it against his chest. He said, "I heard about the papers." Grace said, "Yes." He said, "The note on the house." Grace said, "I can pay it." He said, "I know." He looked past her at the door of the house on Bell Lane and at the smoke going straight up from the stovepipe into the tin-colored sky. He said, "Your father was a better man than I gave him credit for." Grace said nothing. Rusk Mallon put his hat back on and rode away up Bell Lane, slower than he had come. A week passed, and then another. Outsiders began arriving at the depot. A surveyor with a chain and a tripod. A stockman from the county seat asking after the running sea over a bar. A woman in a black bonnet who had known Grace's grandmother as a girl and who cried at the churchyard fence and would not be comforted. Grace signed papers at the lawyer's small desk in the back room of the mercantile. She paid the note on the house on Bell Lane in full and took the paper back and burned it in the stove. She paid the back taxes on the land at the head of the valley. She kept the coins that were left in the canvas pouch beneath the loose board where the tin had been, because her grandmother had put them there, and Grace did not yet see a better place. She rode out to the head of the valley on a borrowed horse, and stood in grass to her knees by a creek that ran clear even in the cold, and she understood then what her grandmother had held for 40 years, and for whom, and why. The town changed the way towns change, slowly and without saying so. Boys on the corner stopped shouting about a dead man in her parlor. The woman behind the mercantile counter called her Miss Cooper. At the pump on Bell Lane, women moved aside to let her draw first. In the churchyard, Grace put a small flat stone at the foot of her grandmother's grave with the letter M cut into it, and no one asked her why, and she did not explain. Old Hollis was on the bench outside the smithy on the last warm afternoon of that long winter, and Grace stopped at the bench and stood before him with her hands folded in front of her apron. She said, "I understand you now." Old Hollis looked up at her with his pale blue eyes, and for the first time in her life she saw him smile, which was only a small movement at the corner of his mouth. He said, "Good." He did not speak again. At the head of the valley in the last week of spring, Grace stood on the porch of a small cabin she had paid 2 men from town to raise for her by the creek. The cabin was rough and new and smelled of cut pine. Behind the cabin was a lean-to for a horse she did not yet own, and a shed for a maul that she did. On the mantel inside were 3 things: the family Bible, the tintype of the young mustached man with her father's eyes, and the small unloaded revolver on which was still tied the note that said, "His, do not sell." Outside the light had gone the color of pale honey and then the color of poured amber, and the ridge above the valley held the last of it a long time before letting go. Grace stood at the porch rail with her braid down her back and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her hands calloused new in the places where the maul had been. The woman whose family Grace had sheltered came up the track that evening with her man and her child, bringing a jar of preserves and a young hound pup on a length of twine. The pup sat down in the grass and would not come further. The child ran to Grace and put her arms around Grace's knees. The woman said, "We wanted you to have him, for the nights." Grace knelt in the grass and let the pup smell her hand. The pup put its head against her wrist. Grace said low, so that only the pup could hear, "You and me." She stood up with the twine in her hand. The man said, "Miss Cooper, what will you call this place?" Grace looked out across the grass to the creek and up the ridge to where the last light was letting go, and she said, "I did not inherit a dead man's trouble. I inherited what he was keeping for us." The man took off his hat. The woman put her hand on her child's head. The pup leaned against Grace's boot, and the light went, slow and clean, off the ridge and into the sky, and the valley held its quiet the way it had held it for 40 years, waiting for a Cooper to come home. Thank you for staying to the end of this one, for riding out the long night on Bell Lane and up into the valley with Grace. This was a story about what patience keeps safe until the right hands come for it. If it moved you, leave a kind word below. Tell us where you're listening from, and follow along for the next tale. A widower, a starving mare, and a barn nobody would buy. Rest easy.